Happy Friday to everybody. For those of you here and those of you online, it feels a little bit like a ghost town here in the classroom today. Everybody, it's always it was weird. It was during the pandemic and during the summer. It's always had the same feel to it. It's kind of like those old westerns where you'd walk through the middle of a popular town. Everybody was indoors, everybody gone, and like had the western music in the background. Wow, 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 in the background. And, kind of how it feels today with everybody being gone. But we got stuff to talk about today, whether you're here or you're abroad. We need to prepare for the exam we got coming up on Wednesday. So let's go ahead and get at it. And as before, as I'm going through this, I'm going to kind of give you some highlights of what I think is important. Does not mean that anything that I do not cover will be on the exam. Anything that's in the study guide can be covered on the exam. I may have some specific instructions on certain items. I definitely recommend you take notes. I do want to clarify that I used some terms that are kind of unique to this version of the study guide. I used identify and define. If you see the word identify, that basically means that you should be able to look at the definition and understand what I'm talking about in a particular context. Define is just the opposite. If I give you a term, you should be able to provide me with a clear definition of what that term means. As far as the breakdown of content, there are 20 multiple choice questions. That's basically 3 questions from each chapter. The only one that's an exception to is chapter 11. There's only 2 multiple choice questions in chapter 11. And then there's 2 multiple choice questions each from Excel and the NetSuite, or sorry, 3 multiple choice questions each from Excel and NetSuite. And yeah, so it's very similar to the format of the practice exam that you all worked on. There will be 1 problem on the exam, and it's going to consist of 6 parts. So that actually represents chapters 10 through 14 all together. So it's bundled all together, different components and different concepts covered in the same problem, which again is very similar to the way that the practice exam is set up. All right, let's go ahead and talk about some things that I think are relative importance. Like I said, I'm going through this and I don't cover something and you want clarification of it, please raise your hand or chime in. I don't want to say, you probably want to yell into the chat because I'm going to yell into Zoom because I'm not going to be monitoring the chat since the bar is hidden from me whenever I'm through. If you have a question, you can shoot it to me. If you're not comfortable sending through chat, obviously you can send it through an email. We've got several days before the exam, so you can clarify something like that. But if you just want to pipe in and say, Dr. Barnes, in the Zoom, that's absolutely fine as well. All right, so starting out chapter 10, we talked about the big data, the 5 V's. Remember, the book only talks about 4 V's. We need to know all 5. So you need to know what each of the 5 V's are, as well as their appropriate adjectives that are associated with them. You don't need to get too fancy on this. If you say the first VV is volume, if you say high volume instead of huge volume, I'm not going to count off. Okay, I want to know whether it's big or small, and so it's a high or low, basically. Then the definition for data analytics, we talked a little bit about that. So what data analytics is, the definition behind that, and what data analytics is designed to do to accomplish. So might want to take a look at that. It's not a particularly complex definition, but it is an important definition to have in mind since it sets the tone for the entire chapter. The 2 steps in data analytics, please make sure you're familiar with those. We actually refer back to those when we get to the AMP model. These are kind of subsets of the AMP model. One of the things that's important to note is that we take most of our time in the ETL step. That was 50 to 90% of the time versus process analyze, which means that the fun part is usually the part that we spend the least amount of time on, as is everything in life, by the way. The fun stuff is less time than the work. But unfortunately, that's just true about everything. The AMPS model, the 4 parts of the AMPS model are going through here. There's a lot of stuff with this, so make sure you are clear on this area right here. Spend a lot of time focused on this. So AMPS model asks the question, master the data. Under master the data, it says there are 4 types of data questions in this step. Okay, so what are the 4 types of data questions? There's accessibility, reliability, integrity, and type. And this is actually in the chapter 10 slides, slide number 12. Okay, so make sure you take a look at those and are familiar with those. Also, there's a question about audit data standards. Now, I want to be very clear about this. Audit data standards represent data standards that can be used in any setting. But the original intention of audit data standards were actually to provide standards for data to be used in an external audit. Okay, and they can be applicable in other scenarios. But the example I talked about when I talked about is like trying to export a PDF into an Excel format, which is very difficult if you've never tried to do that before. It's very near to impossible. So that's why we have these standards now that we define. We tell clients we need it in this format with these parameters, with this information provided to us so that we can actually have a clear depiction and we can actually utilize this data in our own tools. Audit data standards, again, that's an important thing. It's emanated from problems with articulating information through external audit. So basically, audit data standards were developed and now they're utilized as a standard. In the performing the analysis, the 4 types of data analysis, this one's one that we visited multiple times. I said you should be able to define each type of analysis and provide examples of each. So let's go through the 4 types. There's the descriptive, there's the diagnostic, there's predictive, and prescriptive. And we're going to talk about those at length in the practice exam. There's a couple of questions on those. I'm going to tell you right now, you should know the definitions for all of them. You should know when they're used. Also remember that we did some specific Excel activities over these types of analytics. You probably should spend some time reviewing those Excel activities to recall why those Excel activities were applicable in those scenarios. Because remember, we did a descriptive analytic activity where we did a accounts receivable allowance for uncollectible accounts, and we were trying to determine what does that tell us. So remember, descriptive analytics tells what happened, and the whole point was determine what's going on with the accounts receivable and who's got accounts that are out of date. So being able to apply those to all those scenarios is really important. So please revisit those Excel assignments that were applicable specifically to the 4 types of data analysis. All right, that does it for chapter 10. Chapter 11, the key types of visualization. There will be questions on the exam on this. There were questions on the practice exam about this. Please be very familiar with these. Specifically, when I talk about what the type of the chart is, you should be able to identify what is the type of data that it's used to test, or vice versa. If I give you the type of data, you should be able to know the type of chart. Okay. I'm not big on memorization, but I think this is something that's fairly intuitive as long as you spend a little bit of time focusing on it. I don't think you need to memorize it verbatim, but you should have a pretty good understanding of when we use a chart in a WIT scenario. So, I will definitely be asking questions on these 6 areas right here, so just make sure you're familiar with those. And then, so yeah, just reiteration, that's what this says right here. As far as Power BI, what are the 3 view types in Power BI? Please keep in mind that there were 3 views that we talked about. There's the report view, the table view, and the model view. Okay. The report view is basically where we perform the visualization task. We create our visualizations for reporting purposes, obviously. Modeling is where we look at the logical relationships between each of the tables that we have in there, and we try to define the associations. Specifically, what is the primary key connected to which foreign key, and which direction does that move? And the table view is, I think I said model view on that one. Yeah, the model view, and then that's the model view is when we look at the associations. Table view is like looking at it through an Excel lens, looking at what the tables look like. This is where we can actually add and edit data. So edit the format of the data that's been presented, and then add new columns based on characteristics of existing columns. Remember, we did that test amount calculation in Power BI, and that was just a function of other columns that already existed in the data. That was an example of how we could actually create new data within the table view. All right, chapter 12. Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash systems. Everybody remember the author's name of that, by the way? Satoshi Nakamoto. I think I talked about that. Satoshi Nakamoto is not a real person. The pseudonym, yeah. Some people say it's Elon Musk. I think fewer people are confident with that every day. But, Satoshi Nakamoto is attributed. So primary goals of early blockchain system. Let me just actually go to the slides that I want you to look at. So there's one slide that I think is very important for you to make sure you're clear on. That's slide number 2 in chapter 12. And so that's this slide right here. So what were the goals of Bitcoin? Early goals of creating a distributed ledger system, resource intensive mining, and elimination of financial intermediaries. So basically eliminating people in the middle that have to actually help out with the transactions. Wanted to make them online, peer-to-peer, and be trustless systems. So make sure you're familiar with all those concepts that are listed up here on that. I'm not going through it as much detail as I went through during the lecture, but it's all fairly intuitive. You remember the stuff we talked about in the lecture. Okay, going back to the study guide. We had 4 types of blockchain systems. Remember, the book only talks about 3 types of blockchain systems. I added a 4th one. So the three that the book talks about were public, private, and consortium. And then I added a 4th one called hybrid. please be able to identify those systems and define them. You need to provide a basic definition for each of these types of blockchain systems when they're going to be used and know what circumstances they can be utilized for. A little bit later on, we get into machine learning. There are going to be plenty of questions about machine learning. So let's just go ahead and start. These first three questions, be sure you have a very strong, detailed definition for machine learning, deep learning, and neural networks. I know these are vague conclusions. I don't expect anybody to be an expert at these concepts, but we did define each of these terms in the slide, so be sure you can reiterate those definitions. It doesn't need to be verbatim, but you need to be able to kind of capture the important points that I talked about during the lecture. The two types of tasks that machine learning systems are designed to perform. That's regression, or sorry, classification or regression. Make sure you understand the difference between those terms, and you can actually define each of those. And then something that's going to be really important, there will definitely be questions on, are going to be the 4 types of machine learning. So let's just go through those. We got supervised machine learning, unsupervised learning, semi-supervised, and reinforcement. Supervised is where we have a known input and a known output. So this is basically testing the machine learning tool to make sure it's doing the job properly. Because we know what the results should be, we can check the machine learning results against the actual results, what the results should be. Then we have unsupervised, which unsupervised is where we let the machine learning tool loose. We know what the input is, but we have no idea what the output is. That's going to be what the machine learning tool provides for us. Then we have semi-supervised learning, where semi-supervised learning is basically using fuzzy information. By that, I mean some of the information is not provided. There's not known inputs or known headers or no detail, where the machine learning tool has to basically fill in the blanks. It has to fill in basically what's missing and try to actually use its best judgment from that. And the final one is going to be reinforcement learning. Reinforcement is based on a trial and error basis. So it provides feedback. It's going to be updated based on the or we provide the machine learning term feedback and it updates it. So example of this is like going to some ChatGPT and asking it a question. It provides a very confident and positive response, but those response is incorrect. And the user says, no, that's incorrect. Let me explain why that's incorrect. ChatGPT updates the protocols based on information that you provide to it, okay? So it updates its knowledge based on feedback from the users. Yeah, and by the way, just to reinforce reinforcement learning, the 3 words you're looking for are trial and error, okay? The trial and error basis. All right, chapter 13. So internal controls, we have 3 general categories of internal controls. Be able to define each category, provide examples of each. This is a really important one, as I alluded to. So 3 general categories of internal controls are preventive controls, then detective and corrective controls. Remember, detective and corrective are generally used jointly together. Okay, when there's a problem, we have to find it and then we have to fix it. But preventive controls, that prevents a problem from occurring in the first place. And so example of preventive controls, segregation of duties. Example of detective controls would be reconciliations. And an example of corrective controls would be backups. So there's a lot of other categories in those areas, but I think those are the ones we talked about on the slides. That's all you really need to know in that. 2 categories of systems or IT controls. We have access and application controls. Remember, access controls can also be called general controls. Our definitions for those have not changed since we talked about them back in the first exam. Access controls control what the employee has access to or the user has access to. And then application controls track what the system activities are, what's going on in the system activities. Basically provides an audit trail. All right. 2 primary organizational governance frameworks. Those are going to be the COSO Internal Controls Integrated Framework and the COSO Enterprise Risk Management Framework. You do need to know a lot about the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework, which we're going to get to here in just a second. COSO ERM, you just need basically know its existence. In fact, in the study guide, this last point right here, it says, what are the objective components of the ERM Risk Management Framework? That's question right there. You can actually cross that out. That doesn't need to be in your study guide anymore. I meant to remove that from last semester and I just completely forgot. And I realized it when I was preparing for the lecture today. So you can get rid of that right there. That's not going to be a question. The only thing you have to know is COSO ERM framework. You don't need to know too much more about it other than the fact that it exists. 3 primary organizational or primary information technology governance frameworks. That is COBIT, ITIL, and ISO 27000 series. So be sure that you understand what the objectives of each of those are, and you understand the broad objectives of each of those 3 governance frameworks. Okay, because those three governance frameworks definitely had three different objectives in mind when they were created. That those are all related to IT governance and how those what those meant to what each one is meant to accomplish. So make sure you take a look at those. All right. I can never stress this enough because I say this on every exam, and yet I still don't seem to get the results that I expect to get. You do need to know the COSO internal control integrated framework extremely well. Okay, know it really, really well. So these three lines right here, highlight those, spend plenty of time on those. These will absolutely be on the exam. There will be multiple questions on these, so you will want to make sure you cover this. So what do you need to know? At the very basic, you need to know what the three objectives of the COSO framework are. So remember, the three objectives relates to the reliability of financial reporting, the accomplishments of operations, and the compliance. I know it's compliance. I'm trying to remember what the other terminology is. Meeting compliance requirements of the industry that the operating in. But basically, broadly speaking, it's reporting, operations, and compliance. The five components of COSO 2013, those are control environment, entities risk assessment, control activities, information communication, monitoring. Not only do you need to know what those titles are, but you need to be able to define each one of those. Okay, that is just absolutely a necessity for this particular concept. 100% chance that I will ask you that on the exam. I'm not going to hide it behind it. You just need to know all that information. So everything I just talked about right there. Obviously, it doesn't need to be word for word on the objectives since I didn't give it word for word right there. It's basically reporting, operations, compliance are the three objectives. But you do need to know the five components. You need to be able to define those very, very clearly. All right, chapter 14. We talked about the primary focus areas for information security. It's also referred to the CIA triad, which I made a corny joke about that in the lecture. But the CIA is confidentiality, information, and confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These are all aspects that have to be met in order for information to be viewed as secure. All right. Some examples of external threats. There was a big long list of those. Please make sure you take note of some specific ones. Make sure you're familiar with the concepts of social engineering, data breaches, and ransomware. I talked a little bit about those in the lecture. Okay. Encryption and authorization or authentication, excuse me. I make that mistake every single period and still can't get by it. Okay, encryption authentication. So what are the respective roles of encryption and authentication? So first of all, be able to define what encryption is and be able to define what authentication is. So encryption basically disguises the information that's being transferred. Authentication is verifying the identity of the user transferring the information, okay? So verification identity is the kind of the basis of authentication, whereas encryption is basically just kind of disguising the information so it cannot be utilized. There are two types of encryptions that we talked about. We talked about symmetric key encryption versus asymmetric key encryption. Be able to roughly define each type of encryption and explain how each type of encryption works. So I talked about this in context with the chapter 14 slides. I said there were two slides that I thought were really important. This is something that I reflected back on Wednesday when we went through the homework. Again, I'm going to reiterate, make sure you're familiar with the information that's in these two slides. Not just the analogies. The analogies are good. Okay, if you can use the analogies, great. But be able to talk about the characteristics of symmetric key encryption versus the characteristics of asymmetric encryption as well. There's a question on hashing. What is the goal of hashing? That's talked a little bit about in the chapter 14, slide 12. So hashing is just basically trying to make sure that the file sent is identical to the file received. Also, digital signatures. You don't need to know too much about digital signatures because it is pretty complex, but you might want to know that encryption and hashing, these are actually used jointly together to create digital signatures, okay? And that actually reflects to a question that we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. The components of the fraud triangle, make sure you're familiar with Cressy's hypothesis. Make sure you understand how that evolved into the fraud triangle. Three components: incentive or pressure, opportunity, and then attitude or rationalization. So I tend to shorten it to pressure, opportunity, rationalization. So the three components. Be able to identify each component, provide examples of each. The examples do not need to be that complex. You can use them in business environment or you could use a classroom environment. You could say, all right, my pressure, I need an A and I need to get an A in AIS. Opportunity, Dr. Barnes isn't paying attention when we're taking the exam. Rationalization, Dr. Barnes is really unfair with his grading. Something along those lines would be fine, okay? You can actually use that as an example of fraud because cheating is a form of fraud. Yes, that's it. It's also a good idea not to cheat in my class, seeing as I'm a forensics expert. All right, so just a good advice for you. What are some examples of preventive controls in the system related to system availability? That actually is the last series of slides that we talked about in chapter 14. So analytical power supply, fault tolerance, virtualization and cloud computing, examples of corrective controls, disaster recovery planning, and business continuity management. That's specifically what I was referring to, is the information in these slides right here. So make sure you can loosely define each of these and know the difference between each of them. As far as Excel in class activities, there's a couple things you should remember. First of all, I already alluded to when during chapter 10 and chapter 11, we had a series of in-class activities that were referring back to the different types of data analytics. So remember, we did two data analytics, or data analytics over descriptive and diagnostic on one day, and then we did data analytics over predictive and prescriptive analytics on the second day. So make sure you're familiar with those and make sure you understand why each of those analytics that we performed fall within those given categories, and you can refer back to those. Also, as far as the in-class activity go, anything that we did in here is going to be valid. If we used a particular function, you are responsible for knowing the components of that function. I'm going to reiterate this one more time. I think I've said it like 3 times, but I'm going to say it again, okay? There will absolutely be a question on the index match function on the exam, so make sure you know that one cold, okay? I'm not going to ask you about index match match, but I will ask you about index match on there, so you do need to know the components of that function. Know it very, very well. As far as anything else that's listed up there is live for the questions that could be in the Excel functions. The next week assignments, there's not really too much I can add to these. If you can answer these questions really, really easily, then you should be pretty good. The questions on the questions that were on the study guide, or sorry, the practice exam should give you a pretty good guideline to that question I'm going to be asking for the exam itself. So make sure you're familiar with that, and you do some review as necessary for that. You can either watch the videos that we went through in class, or you can go log into your account and walk through it manually if you remember how to do those. That's all you really need to know about it. All right, anything in the study guide that I did not cover that you were need some clarity about, or anything in confusion? All right, let's talk about the practice exam then. Question number 1. Data analytics professionals estimate they spend how much time of their cleaning data in order to perform analysis on it. So what is the range on that? That was 50 to 90%. Seems like a weird thing to ask a question on, but it was such a substantial fact that I felt it was necessary to ask a question about it. Keep in mind that data analysis, a lot of that time is spent to the baby cleaning process. Which of the following is not part of the AMPS model? So the AMPS model is our backbone for chapters 10 and part of chapter 11. Okay, so what is in that? Ask the question, master the data, perform the analysis, and share the story. So parse the data is not actually part of that, so we can eliminate C. All right, as I said, there will be multiple questions on this, and we can see it. Which type of data analysis is used to determine if something will happen in the future, okay? So let's just go through each of the definitions of these. Descriptive analysis, what happened? Diagnostic analysis, why did it happen? Predictive analysis, what will happen? And then prescriptive analysis, based on what we think will happen, what should we do? So which of these is what will happen? That's C, okay? C is our answer here. Which statement best describes data visualization? Okay, so data visualization, remember we talked about that in chapter 11. And the thought behind the data visualization is that if we present things through a detailed image, it actually provides more clarification of what the story we're trying to tell, rather than just presenting it through words. So data visualization is the process of presenting information through images. Basically all there is to it. Before preparing a visualization of Power BI, a user must verify the associations that exist in the data, the tables being used in the visualization. What view in Power BI is used for this task, okay? So this is basically looking, before we actually prepare our visualizations, we want to look at the associations between each table and make sure they're clear, that we understand them, and they're representative of that. Now, fortunately, when we did Power BI set those relationships up for us, those associations up for us, but we still checked them to make sure they were correct. What view did we actually do that in? That was going to be in the model view, C. All right, which of the following is a key benefit of a blockchain system? So is it asynchronous updating? The answer is no. Actually, blockchain is synchronous updates, okay? Full transparency of the system, that sure sounds like a good benefit, and that is one of the benefits of blockchain, so that's our answer, but let's go through the rest. Single copy of the general ledger, Actually, we have multiple copies of the general ledger. They're on all systems on the blockchain and they update simultaneously. So by definition, D cannot be it since A and C are not there. So B is our answer. All right. A company and its key suppliers, which we can loosely conglomerate that as a group of entities, agree to set up a secure blockchain between them to facilitate purchases or purchase and return transactions. Which of the following types of blockchain would be used in this situation? So we're talking about a group setting up a permissioned blockchain. That's probably going to be a consortium blockchain because that's the definition of a consortium blockchain. Remember, private blockchain is the one central authority with a permission process. Public is just basically no permission process whatsoever. It does have central authority, but there's no permission. Hybrid is basically there's going to be one central authority, but there's some sort of permissionless process to gain access to it. Okay, so it's a combination of public and private. The consortium is the ones being defined here. A bank has an external list of customer credit scores on hand. The bank uses machine learning techniques to develop its own credit ratings for each customer, which it compares to the external list. Which type of machine learning is the bank using? So the bank has a list of the customer scores, credit scores. Remember, the credit scores are developed based on inputs that are generated to drive that output. So it knows what the inputs are, it knows what the outputs are. That is considered to be supervised learning, okay? Because supervised learning by definition is a known set of inputs and outputs. So it's actually using the machine learning tool to see, are we getting the same results with our machine learning tool as they would get developing credit ratings? And trying to actually use that tool to develop a credit ratings analysis system. All right, reconciliation of cash accounts may be referred to as what type of control? So you can ignore adjustive, because adjustive is not a real type of control. We have preventative, detective, and corrective, okay, or preventive. Can we say reconciliation is preventive control? No, because if the problem's already happened, that's when we're going to capture it. So can we say reconciliation is a detective control? The answer is yes, it is a detective control. If there's a problem, it will actually detect that problem and it will say it's something we need to fix. Then subsequently, we'll have a corrective control in place to fix the problem. So the reconciliation of cash accounts is considered to be a detective control. In a computerized environment, internal controls can be categorized in which of the following. So we're talking about IT controls specifically here. Remember, IT controls are our access and application controls. What's another word for access control? Those are general controls, okay? So general and application controls, that's A. That's our answer. Blank is characterized by the actions of individuals who lead the organization, the tone at the top. All right, we got a COSO question. And I said this is the most important component of the COSO framework. So we start out and we say, basically, what is the attitude of people who are responsible for controls in the organization, and the executives, the managers of the organization? If it's strong, then the controls are good. If it's weak, the controls are bad. This is the control environment. This is a control environment that we're looking at right here. All right, question number 12. Asymmetric key encryption uses which of the following techniques to allow users to communicate securely? So does it use a message digest? The answer is, does it use a message digest? The answer is no. That's just an aggregation of digital signatures, which is an external function. 16-bit encryption key. Actually, most asymmetric key encryption occurs across a 128-bit encryption key. Does it use a public key and a private key? Yeah, that is something we do know about because asymmetric key encryption has to be something that's can be conveyed to external users. So we actually use a public key and then they have a private key for unlocking their end. And then digital signature. It's important to note digital signature is related to this, but a symmetric key encryption does not use a digital signature. We can actually create digital signatures from asymmetric key encryption. So it's the opposite or association there. So the easiest answer there is to say we're going to use a public key and a private key in asymmetric key encryption. All right, blank is an information security procedure that utilizes an algorithm to determine that a received file is identical in content to what was sent. We've talked about this a couple times already. It was one of our homework questions on Wednesday. What is that actually checking to make sure that what is same as sent is received? That's called hashing. Okay, that's hashing. So A is our answer. Chris's hypothesis states the following: trusted persons become trust violators when they conceive of themselves as having a financial problem which is non-shareable. That's the underlying part. So this is basically saying, look, I've got a trouble and I don't think that I can solve this problem other than defrauding an organization. So what is that going to be? What is going to be a reason that somebody would want to would have I don't want to use the actual word, they want to commit fraud, okay? The answer is that's an incentive to commit fraud, something that actually motivates them to do something. Okay, that's what's underlined here. As part of the Excel data analytics activity from Chapter 10, we created a pivot table summarizing a set of journal entries to determine why transactions were being entered and approved by the same person. What type of data analysis activity represent? So remember, we talked about this loosely. I said it was kind of a misnomer because we didn't actually do the follow-up about why these persons were entering the same activity. But the idea, the intention is that we identify the individuals who had the authorization and entry function, and we'd follow up on that and say, why did this happen? What type of question is trying to be asked when we answer, why did something happen? That's a diagnostic analysis. Diagnostic analysis. Question number 16, for Excel activities, we explored the newer function Excel XLOOKUP. Which of the following describes one of the differences between VLOOKUP and XLOOKUP? This is a really devious question right there, but I'm a very devious individual, so that works out, okay? So VLOOKUP requires the users to specify an array. No, actually, that's XLOOKUP that requires the users to specify an array, whereas VLOOKUP can use either arrays or columns as a return. So you have to transpose these two. So A is not correct. VLOOKUP can index based on vertically presented data, where XLOOKUP can index on both vertically and horizontally. That is a correct statement. So B is our answer. And VLOOKUP will return only exact matches in your search, whereas XLOOKUP defaults to finding approximate matches unless you specify otherwise. Again, I transposed VLOOKUP and XLOOKUP. XLOOKUP will return only exact matches, where VLOOKUP will actually approximate unless you specifies. Remember, that's actually a question I asked on the first exam. You have to put the word false into the VLOOKUP to make sure you get the exact match. All right. Refer to the following image. I love this question. Excel rules. What will be the result of the formula in C1? Well, let's take a look. So we're saying we're using a mid function. We're looking at A1, so we're looking at this cell right here. We're looking at the length. We're measuring the length of Excel. So this would actually return a result of 5 plus 1, okay? So this is our starting point in the mid function. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we add 1 to 6. And it says pull everything 10 characters, which we don't have full 10 characters, but it doesn't really matter. It's going to do as many characters as it can. So it's going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or 1, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we'll pull the rules exclamation mark. That's D, okay? One of the first tasks we performed in NetSuite, part of purchasing process, was to examine one of the defaults in accounting preferences. What was the purpose of this action? So this was it's kind of a memorization task, but it was a really important one, okay? So remember, if we did this, we had to actually look and see that the bill in advance of receipt was not checked. That was one of the things we had to look at for the purchasing process. So why did we make sure that bill in advance of receipt was not checked? And that's because we did not want vendors sending invoices to us before they actually delivered the goods. Because what's the danger if they send invoices to us ahead of time? We can actually pay the invoice, and then they just never send us the goods and say, well, free money, okay? So bill in advance receipt had to be not checked, and the whole point of that was B, prevent vendors from sending invoices prior to delivering orders. Final step in the purchasing process to issue payment to the vendors. In NetSuite, which account do we use to make this payment? Probably is intuitive, okay? So what does the transaction look like when you make a payment? Remember, when you actually generate purchase, that's when you actually receive the goods. So you can say you debit inventory or goods or whatever it is, purchases, and you credit AP. Then when you make payments, that's when you debit AP, accounts payable, to get rid of it. And what do we credit? We credit cash, okay? What transaction account most likely represents the cash transaction account this is going to come from? That's checking. See, checking is the account that we looked at specifically, okay? So we looked at specifically to make sure the cash came from that checking account. All right. Which of the following transaction areas refer to the following transaction areas in the NetSuite revenue process, which is the correct sequence? By the way, this one's a pretty easy question. All I did is I had the correct sequence, and then I randomized the rest of them, just in a random order. So all you really needed to know was which is the first step in the sequence. So which one is the first step in the sequence if we're going to do a revenue transaction? Technically speaking, we probably need the customer's purchase order, but that's not actually something that goes into NetSuite, okay? We receive that externally. Once we have the customer's purchase order, what are we going to create from that customer purchase order? That's when we're going to enter the sales order. We're going to create a sales order into that in the system. Once the sales order entered, we have to have approval, because remember, we went through that approval step. We said approve the sales order. Once it's been approved, we can fulfill the order. Then we can actually invoice and say, customer, you owe us money, and then they're going to send us payment. So the answer is 3, 2, 4, 1, 4, 5, 1, which is going to be A. All right. See how far we can go on this before I need to switch over to the answer key. Okay. Big data is frequently characterized by 5V, 5 words beginning with letter V. What are these 5 words? Okay, let's just go through them. Volume, velocity, variety, veracity, and value. Okay. What are the descriptors for each word? Okay, so volume is, what is it? Big, huge volume. Okay, or high volume is fine. Okay. What is velocity? High. Okay. What is variety? Veracity. Low. Remember, veracity is that why am I blanking on the term?
Compare. It's like how well you can authenticate and like
Yeah.
that it's accurate.
Yeah, accuracy is a better term. How accurate the data is. Remember, data out there on the internet not necessarily all that accurate. I couldn't with Kimberly. No, that's the problem with being old and ill. All right, and then value, high. Value is high. Very good. All right. One of the key steps in data analytics is referred to as ETL. What does ETL stand for? E is for extract, T is for transform, and L is load. This is our data cleaning step, our data cleaning and validation step. All right. So examples of different categories of information that might develop as a result of data analytics. For each of these, identify with which, so this should be which type of visualization would be the most appropriate for the type of information presented. For demographic information or treatment students based on classification. So for categorical data, this is actually the very first one we talked about. Categorical data is going to be using a bar chart, either vertical or horizontal, would be fine, okay? Geographic location of students prior to attending treatment state, which is geospatial data. What are we going to use for that? What do you use a map? Yeah, for geographic data, use a map. If you're going to be traveling somewhere, use a map. Same thing for geographic data or geospatial data. The proportions or percentage of students in each major at treatment state, which is a proportional measure. What is that? Pie or donut chart. So the food charts, we're going to use proportional charts. So pie or donut chart would be fine. All right. What are the 2 types of machine learning systems or 2 types of tasks machine learning systems designed to perform? So that's classification and regression. Provide a brief definition of each task. Classification seeks to assign labels, dividing the input into output groups, and regression just seeks to predict real numbers. Through the combination of those, we can actually accomplish multiple different tasks. All right. What are the 3 information technology governance frameworks we examined in this course? Briefly define each. So, by the way, if I ask a question like this on the exam, you do not need to have the verbatim names for each of them. If you just have the acronyms, that's fine, okay? That's control objectives for information and related technology. Okay, that's COBIT, okay? That's IT governance and management. That's all you really need to define for that. So if you wrote down COBIT, IT governance management, that's cool. That's all you needed. Then you have Information Technology Infrastructure Library, which is ITIL. And ITIL is IT services and establishing the scope of IT service management. More appropriately, if you said ITIL, IT service management, that would be fine. All right. And then International Organization for Standardization, which is ISO 27000 series. So ISO 27000, and that's Information Security Management System, or an ISMS, or Information Security Management would be fine. Any one of those. But they 3 combined to address different aspects of different components of information technology governance. Then finally, the primary focus of information security is to provide the balanced protection of data. What 3 data characteristics is InfoSec designed to ensure? I give you a little bit of a hint. It's the blank, blank, blank triad. What are those 3 letters? CIA triad, because it's a silly joke that I made in the presentation. Sounded like a government or agency working with a criminal agency, okay? Which I know that's ridiculous, but the thing is, if it's ridiculous, it'll help you remember. So what does CIA stand for? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those are the 3 aspects of data that must be met for information to be secure. All right, that does it for the exam review. That does it for all that. Are there any questions before we depart and call it good? All right, as before, please make sure you have a pencil and an eraser. I strongly recommend that you do not use a pen for the exam. I recommend that you show up a little bit early so that you can actually have time for the exam, meeting in this room. Enjoy your break and best luck with your studies.